Today, we will be looking at 14 horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. Each will send chills down your spine. What you're about to hear is intense. As always, viewer discretion is advised. On November 4th, 2014, two experienced cave divers prepared for what should have been a routine exploration of the system's deeper reaches. Their equipment reflected serious intent. Dive propulsion vehicles mounted and ready, main breathing tanks configured in side mount position, and additional stage bottles clipped to their gear to extend their underwater endurance. Their destination, Jackson Blue Spring in Florida. The golden line starting from the cave entrance was a crucial navigation cord that would guide them in through the underwater maze and safely back out to daylight. Florida's cave diving community had established this system over decades of exploration. Gold-colored rope marking the main passages, white lines indicating explored side tunnels that deliberately remained disconnected from the primary route. The logic was survival. Divers emerging in reduced visibility would follow gold to safety, avoiding the confusion that could prove fatal in the underground darkness. Their dive propulsion vehicles hummed to life as they descended into Jackson Blue's crystalline waters. The scooters, essential tools for covering the vast distances required in serious cave exploration, pulled them effortlessly through passages that would exhaust swimmers relying on the fins alone. Each diver carried substantial equipment loads, primary breathing gas supplies, backup tanks, lights, and the various tools required for safe penetration into Florida's most challenging underwater environments. The golden line unspooled ahead of them as they navigated deeper into the system. At 2,300 feet, 701 meters from the entrance, they reached a section known to local divers as the trash room. Here, the cave's architecture created a critical decision point. The main passage, marked by its reliable gold line, executed a sharp left turn. Directly ahead, an alternative route continued straight. The Rabbit Hole Bypass. This passage represented one of Jackson Blue's more technical challenges. Rarely used and absent from most cave maps, it required advanced skills that separated casual cave divers from those willing to tackle Florida's most demanding systems. The bypass was known for its restrictive dimensions and propensity for silting, conditions that could trap unprepared divers in zero-visibility emergencies. During their return journey, the two divers approached this junction with their attention focused on navigation and gas management. Cave diving demanded constant awareness of breathing supply consumption, exit routes, and the golden line that represented their lifeline to the surface. However, the combination of scooter operation, equipment management, and the subtle transition from main passage to side tunnel created a moment of confusion. They missed the sharp left turn. Instead of following the gold line's predetermined route, they continued straight into the Rabbit Hole Bypass without realizing they had made an unplanned jump. The initial section of this alternative passage closely resembled the main cave, wide enough for comfortable scooter operation and clear enough for normal navigation. Nothing in the environment immediately signaled their error. The deception continued as they progressed deeper into the bypass. Their scooters maintained steady progress, and the passage dimensions remained manageable. Each diver carried 4 tanks total, 2 primary breathing gas supplies in side mount configuration, plus 2 stage bottles, creating significant bulk that required careful maneuvering through tighter sections. The rabbit hole's true character revealed itself gradually. The passage began to constrict, limestone walls pressing closer together until the dimensions challenged their heavily loaded configuration. Their scooters, designed for open water efficiency, became liabilities in the increasingly cramped environment. The sediment layers that had settled over decades of minimal traffic waited to be disturbed. When they reached the critical restriction, physics and geology conspired against them. The combination of scooters, breathing tanks, and human bodies could not fit through the available space. Their attempts to navigate the obstacle stirred the fine sediment that lined the passage floor and walls. Within moments, the clear water transformed into an opaque cloud that eliminated all visibility. The lead diver found himself trapped in a nightmare scenario, familiar to cave diving accident reports. Zero visibility surrounded him, while he remained tangled with equipment in a passage too small for easy maneuvering. His breathing gas supplies continued their steady countdown toward emergency levels. The restriction that had created the silt cloud now prevented retreat with his full equipment load. His partner, positioned slightly behind in the passage, managed to extract himself from the silted environment. With visibility restored in the clearer water of the main passage, he could assess their situation objectively. The lead diver remained trapped in conditions that prevented immediate self-rescue. Time and breathing gas were becoming critical factors. The second diver made the decision that cave diving protocols demanded in such circumstances. He returned to the main line, confirming his navigation back to the gold-colored rope that marked the safe route to the surface. His exit became a race against time, not for his own survival, but to organize rescue resources for his trapped partner. Underground, the lead diver waited as the disturbed sediment gradually settled. Cave environments possess their own temporal rhythms, and the fine particles that had created his zero-visibility prison slowly drifted back toward the passage floor. As clarity returned incrementally, he could begin the delicate process of extricating himself from the restriction. The visibility improvement allowed careful movement. He worked his way backward through the rabbit hole bypass until he could locate the main passage and its reassuring gold line. However, his breathing gas calculations painted a concerning picture. The extended time spent dealing with the emergency had consumed supplies at rates beyond his original planning. Cave divers plan for such contingencies through community cooperation and established safety practices. He knew of a breathing gas cache placed by another diver along the main route, an emergency supply positioned specifically for situations where planned gas management encountered unexpected circumstances. He located the safety bottle and incorporated it into his exit plan. The additional breathing gas provided the margin needed for safe exit, but his situation remained precarious enough to warrant assistance. As he approached the cavern zone, where natural light began to penetrate the underwater environment, he encountered Ed Sorensen, a renowned cave diving rescue specialist who had responded to the emergency call. Sorensen's presence transformed a potentially fatal situation into a managed emergency. His expertise in cave rescue operations and intimate knowledge of Jackson Blue's passages provided additional safety margin for the final phase of the exit. Together, they navigated toward the surface as the second diver, having successfully summoned help, returned to provide additional assistance. The three divers emerged from Jackson Blue Spring without further incident. Their survival depended on the community practices, emergency protocols, and individual skills that distinguish technical cave diving from recreational underwater activities. The rabbit hole bypass had claimed no lives that day, but it had delivered a harsh reminder of the precision required for safe exploration of Florida's underwater cave systems. On Saturday, December 14th, 2024, the exploration team assembled at the entrance to the Bueno Fontano cave system near Bergamo, Italy, in the pre-dawn hours. 9 experienced cave explorers, led by 32-year-old speleologist Ottavia Piana, prepared for what should have been a routine mapping expedition into the uncharted sections of the vast limestone network. The Bueno Fontano system was already well documented across 19 kilometers, 11.8 miles, of mapped passages, but countless unexplored chambers and tunnels beckoned beyond the known limits. Piana, despite having been rescued from this same cave system just 17 months earlier after breaking her leg, remained undeterred in her passion for underground exploration. The team descended through the familiar entrance passages and made their way toward the unexplored sections. The cave's temperature held steady at 10 degrees Celsius, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, requiring careful attention to hypothermia prevention during extended underground stays. 4 kilometers, 2.5 miles from the surface, the team reached the boundary between charted and uncharted territory. Here, the passages narrowed dramatically, twisting through limestone formations that had remained untouched by human exploration. Progress was methodical. Each step forward required careful testing of handholds and footholds. At approximately 4:30 p.m., the cave betrayed them. Piana was testing a seemingly solid ledge, her full weight committed to the step, when the rock cracked with a sound like breaking bones. The formation, weakened by countless years of water erosion, gave way beneath her feet. Time compressed into horrifying slow motion. Her teammates watched helplessly as she clawed desperately at the crumbling rock face, fingernails scraping uselessly against stone as gravity claimed her. She plummeted 5 meters, 16.4 feet, through absolute blackness, her body rotating helplessly before slamming into the jagged limestone floor below. The impact resonated through the cave like a gunshot, the sickening sound of an impact, followed by the wet sound of a body settling into unnatural stillness and silence. Her teammates scrambled to establish an anchor. The first rescuer rappelled down. As he did, he could hear low moans of agony and despair. The scene below was a nightmare. Piana lay crumpled against the chamber wall. Her left knee was twisted completely wrong, the joint swollen to twice its normal size and bent at an impossible angle. When she tried to speak, her words came out as unintelligible mumbles through what appeared to be multiple facial fractures. Her eyes, when they occasionally focused, held the glassy look of severe trauma and impending shock. All they could understand her saying was, "Never again, never again." The remaining team members stared at each other in the weak glow of their headlamps, the magnitude of their situation crushing down like the tons of rock above them. 4 kilometers of unmapped, treacherous cave passages separated them from the surface. No cell phone signal could penetrate the limestone barrier. Radio calls dissolved into static. Panic began to set in. Time was bleeding away as surely as Piana was bleeding into the cave floor. Every minute of delay decreased her chances of survival, yet any attempt to move her could prove fatal. The team leader made the agonizing decision. The strongest one would make a desperate solo run to the surface, abandoning Piana with minimal medical support in a race against time and hypothermia. At 5:45 p.m., he began the nightmarish journey through 4 kilometers of unmapped passages, crawling, climbing, and scrambling through darkness with only the knowledge that seconds could mean the difference between rescue and recovery of a body. He reached the surface at 8:20 p.m., stumbling from the cave entrance. The Italian National Alpine and Speleological Rescue Corps, CNSS, received the emergency call as darkness settled over the Bergamo Hills. The caller's voice breaking with exhaustion and desperation as he tried to convey the gravity of the situation 4 kilometers underground. Chaos erupted at the CNSS command center. Officers who had managed cave rescues for decades recognized the horrific complexity of the situation immediately. Specialized equipment was loaded into vehicles with frantic efficiency. Cave rescue stretchers, medical supplies rated for extended underground operations, rope systems, and communication equipment. All while knowing that every minute of preparation was another minute that Piana lay bleeding in the darkness below. The first rescue teams reached Piana's location at 8 a.m. the next day, December 15th, nearly 16 hours after the accident. Medical assessment confirmed multiple facial fractures, broken ribs, and a severely damaged knee. More concerning was the risk of internal bleeding and the onset of hypothermia after a night in the 10 degrees Celsius 50 degrees Fahrenheit environment. Piana was carefully secured to a specialized rescue stretcher, her injuries stabilized as much as possible given the challenging conditions. The journey began with teams of 6 rescuers working in carefully coordinated movements. Every 90 minutes, the entire operation paused for medical evaluation and team rotation. In the confined spaces of the cave, rescuer fatigue could prove fatal. A single mistake could endanger not just the victim, but the entire rescue party. She wasn't responding properly, but all they could hear her saying was, "Never again, never again." By the third day, December 16th, rescue teams encountered their first major obstacle, a passage completely blocked by fallen limestone. The geological instability that had caused Piana's accident continued to threaten the rescue operation. Rocks shifted unpredictably as teams passed, creating new hazards with each hour. Rescue coordinators made the difficult decision to use small explosive charges to clear the blocked passage. Each blast was carefully calculated, enough force to move the obstructing rocks without destabilizing the surrounding formations. The cleared passage revealed new challenges. Water seepage had created slick surfaces that made footing treacherous. The rescue teams attached fixed ropes along the route, creating handholds for the dozens of rescuers who would need to navigate the same path. Concern mounted as Piana's condition showed signs of deterioration. 3 days underground, even with medical support, was pushing the boundaries of human endurance. Her core body temperature was dropping, despite thermal blankets and chemical heating pads. The risk of pneumonia from her rib injuries increased with each passing hour in the humid cave environment. On December the 17th, rescue coordinators accelerated the operation, bringing in fresh teams and extending working shifts. The telephone cable network now stretched the full 4 kilometers, 2.5 miles, allowing constant communication between the surface command post and the rescue teams. The teams worked through the night and made steady progress. Now it was Wednesday, December 18th, 2024. At 1:30 a.m., rescue teams reached the boundary between uncharted and mapped territory. The familiar passages of the known cave system offered wider spaces and established routes, but 2 kilometers, 1.2 miles of challenging terrain still separated them from the surface. Progress accelerated through the mapped sections. Rescue teams had pre-positioned equipment and established supply caches throughout the known passages. The stretcher moved more quickly through chambers where every obstacle had been documented and planned for. At 6 a.m., 12 hours ahead of the most optimistic projections, rescue teams emerged from the cave entrance carrying Piana into the dawn light. She had traveled 4 kilometers, 2.5 miles, through unmapped underground passages over 4 days, supported by 159 volunteers who had worked around the clock in some of the most challenging rescue conditions imaginable. Piana was immediately transported to a regional hospital for treatment of her multiple fractures. Medical evaluation confirmed the severity of injuries that had been treated for 4 days in the challenging cave environment: multiple rib fractures and extensive knee damage. After treatment, she started speaking slowly. Her first sentence was that she would never enter a cave again. The rescue operation had consumed 96 hours of continuous effort, involved 159 specialized volunteers, and required the establishment of 4 kilometers, 2.5 miles, of communication cables through previously unexplored cave passages. The operation stood as one of the most technically challenging cave rescues in recent European history. For Piana, the ordeal marked the end of her caving career. The woman who had dedicated years to underground exploration emerged from the earth with a firm resolution never to enter a cave again. The Bueno Fontano system, which had twice claimed her as a victim, would remain forever associated with both the allure and the mortal danger of pushing the boundaries of human exploration into the hidden depths beneath our feet. July 25th, 2015. The temperature soared to 89 degrees Fahrenheit, 32 degrees Celsius, making the humid air feel thick and oppressive. Senior airman Drew Bellairs wiped the sweat from his brow as he packed his gear into the rental car. At 20 years old, the Iowa native had been deployed to Anderson Air Force Base for temporary duty, far from the familiar cornfields of Osage back home. Drew had been counting down the days until this weekend adventure. After weeks of military duties under the scorching Pacific sun, the promise of cool, fresh water at Marbo Cave felt like a gift from heaven. His new friends from the base had spoken of the legendary freshwater pools hidden within the limestone caves of Mangilau, describing them as nature's own swimming paradise. For a young man from Iowa who had spent summers swimming in farm ponds and rivers, the exotic allure of an underground cave system was irresistible. The drive to Marbo Cave took them through winding jungle roads, past towering coconut palms and dense tropical vegetation. When they finally arrived at the trailhead, Drew felt his pulse quicken. The entrance to Marbo Cave lay hidden beneath a canopy of ancient trees, accessible only by a steep, treacherous path that wound down through jagged limestone formations. The rock face dropped away dramatically, revealing glimpses of crystalline water far below. The very air seemed to whisper with mystery and danger. The descent required careful navigation across slippery rocks and through narrow crevices. Drew's military training had prepared him for physical challenges, but nothing had quite prepared him for this vertical maze of coral rock and tropical vegetation. Each step downward brought them closer to the hidden world beneath, where shafts of sunlight penetrated the canopy to illuminate pools of the most beautiful turquoise water Drew had ever seen. At the bottom, the cave system revealed itself in all its terrifying beauty. The main pool stretched approximately 100 feet, 30 meters across, its surface so clear that Drew could see every detail of the limestone bottom, 15 feet, 4.5 meters below. But what captured his attention were the darker openings visible beneath the water, cave passages that disappeared into the unknown depths of the earth. Drew tested the water with his toe and gasped at the shocking coolness. After the brutal heat above, the cave's natural air conditioning felt like stepping into paradise. The water temperature registered a refreshing 78 degrees Fahrenheit, 26 degrees Celsius, a dramatic contrast to the sweltering surface world they had left behind. His friends had already begun exploring, their voices echoing off the limestone walls as they swam between the various pools connected by underwater passages. Drew watched them disappear beneath the surface, only to emerge in completely different sections of the cave system, laughing and calling out about the wonders they had discovered in the submerged chambers. The temptation proved overwhelming. Drew had always been a strong swimmer, comfortable in the water since childhood. Back in Iowa, he had spent countless hours diving to the bottom of the local quarry, holding his breath longer than any of his friends. The cave's underwater passages looked like the ultimate test of his aquatic skills. Drew took several deep breaths, hyperventilating to saturate his blood with oxygen, a technique he had learned from other divers. The limestone walls around him seemed to pulse with anticipation as he prepared for his descent. The water felt silk smooth against his skin as he slipped beneath the surface. The underwater world of Marbo Cave transformed before his eyes. Shafts of filtered sunlight created an ethereal blue-green glow that danced across the limestone formations. Schools of tiny fish darted between the rocks like living jewels, and the complete silence felt almost sacred. Drew felt like an explorer discovering an alien planet. He spotted the entrance to one of the air pocket caves his friends had mentioned, a dark opening in the limestone wall about 8 feet, 2.4 meters below the surface. The passage looked inviting, just wide enough for a person to swim through. Drew had heard that these caves contained air pockets where previous visitors had discovered chambers filled with breathable air, creating underground rooms where you could actually surface and rest before continuing your exploration. Drew's lungs felt strong and confident as he propelled himself toward the opening. The limestone walls closed around him as he entered the passage, and within seconds, the cave's entrance disappeared behind him. The tunnel curved gently upward, just as he had expected, leading toward what should be an air-filled chamber above. But something was wrong. The passage continued much longer than Drew had anticipated. His internal clock told him he had been swimming for nearly a minute, far longer than the few seconds his friends had described. The tunnel seemed to curve and branch in ways that defied his expectations. Worse still, the gentle upward slope he had expected was nowhere to be found. Drew's chest began to tighten with the first whispers of oxygen debt. His body's natural alarm system activated, sending urgent signals that his air supply was running dangerously low. But ahead of him, the tunnel continued into darkness, offering no sign of the promised air pocket. Panic crept into Drew's mind like ice water in his veins. He had entered a section of the cave system that was different from what his friends had described. Instead of a simple swim to an air chamber 20 feet, 6 meters away, he found himself in a complex maze of limestone passages that seemed to stretch endlessly into the earth. Drew attempted to turn around, but the tunnel was barely wider than his shoulders. The limestone walls scraped against his skin as he struggled to reverse direction in the confined space. His movements became frantic and uncoordinated as his oxygen-starved brain began to lose its ability to think clearly. The return journey felt like swimming through molasses. Every stroke required monumental effort as his body desperately craved oxygen. The tunnel that had seemed so short on the way in now stretched like an eternity. Drew's vision began to narrow, and dark spots danced at the edges of his sight. Behind him, far above on the surface, his friends had noticed his prolonged absence. Their casual conversation turned to concern, then to alarm as the minutes ticked by without any sign of Drew's return. They dove repeatedly, searching the various cave entrances, calling his name underwater in the hope that he might hear them and respond. Deep in the limestone maze, Drew's strength was failing rapidly. His powerful swimming strokes deteriorated into weak, uncoordinated movements. The cave walls seemed to close in around him, and his air-starved brain struggled to maintain any sense of direction. He was lost in a three-dimensional puzzle with his life as the stakes. Drew's friends on the surface had organized into a desperate rescue effort. They took turns diving to maximum depth, searching every cave entrance they could find. But Marbo's cave system was vast and complex, with dozens of passages branching in all directions. Without proper diving equipment, Their search efforts were limited to what they could accomplish while holding their breath. In the depths of the limestone labyrinth, Drew's body began to shut down. His muscles, starved of oxygen, could no longer propel him through the water. The beautiful limestone formations that had seemed so magical just minutes before now felt like the bars of an underwater prison. His consciousness began to fade as his brain, deprived of oxygen, started to surrender to the inevitable. The rescue effort above intensified as precious minutes turned into a desperate race against time. One of Drew's friends made the crucial decision to seek help, scrambling up the treacherous path to reach cell phone coverage and call for emergency assistance. But in the remote jungle location of Marbo Cave, help was still many minutes away. By the time the rescue divers arrived with proper scuba equipment, Drew Bellairs had been underwater for far too long. They found him in a narrow passage approximately 40 feet, 12 meters, from the main cave entrance, trapped in a section of the limestone maze that had no air pocket, no escape route, and no mercy for a young airman who had simply wanted to cool off on a hot Saturday afternoon in paradise. The old mountain road between Gómez Farías and Alta Cima had seen countless travelers over the years. Winding through the El Cielo Biosphere Reserve in Tamaulipas, Mexico, it served as a lifeline connecting remote communities through some of the most beautiful and dangerous terrain in the region. The limestone landscape was riddled with natural caves and hidden pits, carved by centuries of water slowly dissolving the rock beneath. On the night of January 18th, 2004, Cornelio Garcia was making his way home along this familiar path. The 30-year-old had spent the evening at a party in Gómez Farías, celebrating with friends as people often did on weekend nights in their small community. The gathering had been lively, filled with music, laughter, and drinks shared among neighbors who had known each other for years. As midnight approached, Garcia decided it was time to head home to his family. He chose to take the old road rather than the longer paved route, a decision that many locals made regularly. The mountain path was rougher but more direct, cutting through the heart of the Biosphere Reserve. Garcia had walked this route dozens of times before, even in darkness, and knew its curves and landmarks well. The night was typical for the region in January, cool but not cold, with the sounds of the cloud forest creating a natural symphony around the narrow road. Garcia set off on foot, following the familiar path that wound upward through the mountains toward Alta Cima. The road was rough enough that even four-wheel drive vehicles had to navigate carefully, but for someone on foot who knew the way, it was manageable. What Garcia didn't account for was how the alcohol from the party might affect his judgment and balance on the treacherous mountain path. As he walked through the darkness, relying on his familiarity with the route, he approached a section of road that curved sharply near the junction for Rancho Cielo. This particular curve was deceptive, and the road surface was uneven from years of weather and minimal maintenance. Just a few feet from where the road made its turn, hidden in the darkness and nearly invisible even in daylight, was a natural pit. The opening was approximately 8 feet, 2.4 meters in diameter, a seemingly modest entrance that belied the terrifying depth below. The pit dropped vertically for 150 feet, 45 meters, into the limestone bedrock, a natural shaft carved by water over geological time. As Garcia navigated the curve, his impaired judgment and the darkness combined with deadly effect. Instead of following the road around the bend, he strayed from the path. Perhaps he was disoriented by the alcohol, or maybe he simply misjudged the curve in the poor light. Whatever the exact cause, Garcia stepped directly into the pit opening. The fall through 150 feet, 45 meters of darkness was catastrophic. Garcia plummeted through the shaft, sustaining massive injuries when he struck the bottom. Now, he lay trapped in the depths of the underground chamber, severely wounded and unable to call for help. The remote location and the pit's depth meant his cries, if any, would never reach the surface. Above ground, the night continued peacefully. The forest sounds hid any noise from the accident, and the pit's remote location meant that no one witnessed Garcia's fall. The disturbed earth around the pit's rim was the only evidence of the tragedy, small scrapes and displaced soil that would later provide crucial clues to searchers. When Garcia failed to return home as expected, his family initially waited with patience. But as Sunday stretched into Monday without any word, concern grew into genuine worry. The search began with family members and friends retracing Garcia's expected route along the old mountain road. They called his name through the forest, checked with neighbors, and explored every turnoff and trail where he might have taken shelter or become lost. The rough terrain made searching difficult, with thick vegetation and uneven ground hiding potential clues. For several days, the search parties found nothing. No signs of Garcia, no indication of where he might have gone or what might have happened to him. The mountains seemed to have swallowed him completely, leaving behind only questions and growing desperation among his loved ones. The breakthrough came when searchers reached the area near the Rancho Cielo Junction, about 200 yards from the main turnoff. The pit was not immediately obvious, but careful examination of the area revealed the disturbed ground around its rim. The scrapes in the earth and displaced vegetation suggested that someone or something had fallen into the opening. However, the pit's depth made it impossible for the family searchers to see the bottom, even with flashlights. The shaft disappeared into complete darkness, and calling down into the void produced no response. The searchers faced a terrible dilemma. They suspected Garcia might be in the pit, but they lacked the equipment and expertise needed to safely explore such a dangerous vertical cave. Garcia's brother made the decision to contact John Musquiz, a well-known cave rescuer from Mante, who had extensive experience in cave rescue operations. Musquiz had spent decades exploring the underground systems of Tamaulipas and was respected throughout the regional caving community for his technical skills and dedication to safety. When Musquiz received the call for help, he immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Cave rescues were always challenging, but recovering someone from a 150-foot pit required careful planning, specialized equipment, and experienced team members. He contacted several fellow cave explorers and arranged to meet at the site, bringing the ropes, harnesses, lights, and technical gear necessary for a deep pit rescue. The rescue team arrived at the location accompanied by members of the local fire department, who provided additional support and coordination. The pit site was exactly as described, a deceptively simple opening in the ground, positioned dangerously close to the rough mountain road where Garcia had been walking. Musquiz and his team began the methodical process of rigging their descent system. They secured ropes to reliable anchor points, checked every piece of equipment multiple times, and established communication protocols for the dangerous descent. In cave rescue operations, safety was paramount. Hasty actions could easily create additional victims rather than helping the original casualty. The descent into the pit revealed the tragic outcome that everyone had feared. Garcia's body was immediately visible at the bottom of the shaft. The severe injuries from the 150-foot, 45-meter fall had proven fatal, and it was clear that Garcia had not survived long after the impact. The recovery operation required the same careful technical approach as the initial descent. Musquiz and his team worked methodically to bring Garcia's body to the surface, a process that took several hours and demanded precise coordination between team members at the bottom and top of the pit. The incident report filed by Musquiz several days later documented the technical details of the rescue operation, while also noting the tragic circumstances that had led to Garcia's death. The combination of alcohol impairment, darkness, and the pit's proximity to the road had created a perfect storm of deadly conditions. The pit near Rancho Cielo remained as it had for centuries, a natural feature of the landscape that would continue to pose risks to unwary travelers. But for those who knew the story of Cornelio Garcia, it would forever serve as a reminder of how quickly the mountains could turn from familiar friend to deadly trap. It was August 21st, 2004. Brian Tyndale and three friends rolled into Ginny Springs around 8:30 p.m. on a Friday night. The 24-year-old had been diving for 3 years and logged over 100 open water dives. This weekend was supposed to be their escape from Tallahassee, camping, diving, and having a good time at one of Florida's most famous springs. They set up camp quickly. 2 friends grabbed the canoe while another got ready to snorkel. Brian had bigger plans. He wanted to check out the underwater cave entrances that made Devil's Ear famous. Little Devil, Devil's Eye, and the main Devil's Ear entrance all beckoned from below. The spring was about 30 meters, 100 feet across, with crystal clear water that stayed at 22 degrees Celsius, 72 degrees Fahrenheit, year-round. At night, the underwater lights created an almost magical glow beneath the surface. The limestone walls dropped straight down, and you could see everything perfectly. It was like looking through glass. Brian geared up with his standard open water equipment. His tank showed 500 psi. Not full, but plenty for what he had planned. He grabbed his single D-cell flashlight and did his final checks. His friends pushed off in the canoe, while the snorkelers slipped into the water. The first dive took Brian down to Little Devil at 9 meters, 30 feet deep, where the entrance appeared deceptively small from above, but opened into something truly spectacular. The entrance was tight and required careful maneuvering, but it opened up into this incredible cathedral-like chamber inside that took his breath away. He poked his head cautiously inside the opening, swept his light beam around the limestone formations and flowstone decorations, then headed back up to the surface to share his excitement. The visibility was absolutely insane, better than any dive site he had experienced in his 3 years of diving, with clarity that seemed almost supernatural. After catching his breath at the surface, Brian went for Devil's Eye. This one was deeper at 12 meters, 40 feet, with a bigger entrance that looked like a perfect oval. He swam just inside the threshold of the opening, and his light revealed multiple tunnels disappearing into complete and absolute darkness, like doorways to another world beneath the earth. The silence down there was incredible and almost overwhelming. Nothing but the gentle sound of his breathing apparatus and the soft percussion of bubbles floating up toward the distant surface. Back on the surface, his friends paddled their canoe over to hear detailed reports about what he'd discovered in the underwater realm below. Brian was absolutely pumped and filled with adrenaline from what he'd seen, describing the caves as even cooler and more spectacular than he'd expected, and the water so incredibly clear he felt like he was flying through liquid air instead of swimming. As the night progressed and the hours slipped by, Brian made several more short dives to different sections of the spring, each time getting more confident and excited about exploring these underwater passages that seemed to call to him. His air supply was steadily decreasing with each dive, but he had one more spot he absolutely wanted to check out before calling it a night. The main Devil's Ear entrance itself, the crown jewel of the entire cave system. Around 2 a.m., Brian checked his pressure gauge one final time and saw the needle pointing to a level that indicated about 12 minutes of air remaining. According to him, it was definitely enough for one quick reconnaissance dive to Devil's Ear itself, just to see what the main entrance looked like from the inside. He told his friends confidently that he'd be right back up to the surface, just a quick peek at the famous entrance, and then they could pack up and call it a successful night of exploration. Devil's Ear opened up at 6 meters, 20 feet deep, revealing an entranceway bigger and more impressive than the other cave openings he had explored that evening. This was the real deal, the main highway into the massive and complex cave system that stretched for miles underground throughout North Florida's limestone bedrock. Brian dropped down through the water column and swam confidently inside, his single light beam beginning to probe the darkness that had never seen sunlight. The passage was huge at first, with his light barely reaching the walls and ceiling. Limestone formations covered everything, and the sand on the bottom swirled around his fins. He kept swimming deeper, following the main tunnel as it curved away from the entrance. Then the ceiling started getting lower. The passage narrowed into what looked like a tight squeeze, maybe 1.2 meters, 4 feet across. Beyond it, his light showed another chamber, dome-shaped and just big enough for a diver to fit through. Brian figured he could make it. He'd squeezed through tight spots before, during his open water dives. He positioned himself carefully and started threading through the restriction, pushing with his fins and pulling with his arms. Halfway through, something went horribly wrong. His tank valve caught on something in the ceiling. He tried to back out, but he was stuck. He pushed forward, still stuck. The more he struggled, the tighter he got wedged in the opening. His movements kicked up sand and silt from the cave floor. In seconds, the water around him turned into a brown cloud. His single flashlight, which had seemed plenty bright before, now barely cut through the murky mess he'd created. Brian's heart started racing. He was trapped in a space barely wider than his body, with limestone pressing in from all sides. Every movement seemed to wedge him tighter. His breathing got faster, burning through what little air he had left. The restriction held him like a vice. Above and below, the cave stretched endlessly in all directions. His light flickered across the silt-filled water, showing nothing but brown murk. The silence that had seemed peaceful before now felt suffocating. He could feel his air getting thinner with each breath. The gauge needle dropped toward empty as panic took over completely. The walls wouldn't budge. The ceiling wouldn't move. He was locked in place in the darkness, 20 feet underwater and 50 feet inside a cave with no way out. Up on the surface, his three friends kept waiting. The canoe drifted slowly across the spring while they watched for Brian's light or bubbles to appear. The snorkeler floated nearby, occasionally diving down to look for any sign of their friend. Minutes ticked by, then more minutes. The time Brian had said he'd be down came and went. They started calling his name across the water, hoping he'd pop up somewhere they couldn't see. But the surface of Devil's Ear stayed perfectly calm. No bubbles, no light moving around below. No Brian. The three friends looked at each other with rapidly growing panic and dread, their casual evening of fun suddenly turning into their worst nightmare. Something was definitely and seriously wrong with the situation, way beyond just Brian taking a little longer than expected. They paddled as hard as they could for the limestone shore, dragged their aluminum canoe roughly up on the bank without regard for scratches, and ran frantically through the darkness toward the Ginny Springs facility to get emergency help. A Ginny Springs diving instructor received the frantic emergency call and responded immediately to the desperate situation. Unlike Brian, this experienced professional had all the proper cave diving gear that was essential for safe underground exploration. Multiple powerful lights with backup batteries, safety guidelines, specialized equipment, and most importantly, years of intensive training for exactly these types of rescue situations that unfortunately occurred too often at cave diving sites. He geared up with practiced efficiency and dropped into Devil's Ear Spring, his powerful lights cutting through the crystal clear water as he descended toward the main cave entrance. His experience told him exactly where recreational divers usually got into trouble, and he swam methodically toward the back sections of the cave system, following the route he knew untrained divers typically took when they got in over their heads. He'd performed rescues like this before throughout his career, and sadly he had a pretty good idea where to look for Brian, based on the typical patterns of these tragic incidents. The restriction came into clear view in his bright light beam, and there, wedged impossibly tight in the narrow opening, with his arms reaching desperately toward the dome chamber beyond, the instructor found exactly what Brian's friends had been dreading to discover. The diving instructor worked carefully to free Brian from the restriction. It took several minutes of precise movements to maneuver his tank valve away from the limestone ceiling where it had caught. Once free, the instructor was able to pull Brian's body back through the narrow opening and into the main passage. Swimming alone through the cave system, the instructor carried Brian toward the entrance of Devil's Ear. The journey back to the surface took about 10 minutes, navigating carefully through the underwater passages with his powerful lights. When he finally emerged at the spring's surface, Brian's three friends were waiting anxiously on shore, hoping for better news than what they were about to receive. Brian's three friends were devastated when the diving instructor surfaced with their companion's lifeless body. What had started as an exciting weekend camping trip at one of Florida's most beautiful springs had turned into their worst nightmare. On July 31st, 2010, what began as a perfect family outing in the scenic wilderness of Snohomish County, Washington, would end in unspeakable tragedy when nature unleashed its violent power in a split second that would forever shatter the lives of the Tam family and expose the deadly reality that even the most beautiful natural attractions can become death traps without warning. The Big Four ice caves had long been one of Washington State's most popular hiking destinations, drawing thousands of families each year to witness the spectacular ice formations that created natural caverns within the mountain's rocky face. The trail leading to these frozen wonders stretched for exactly 1 mile through dense Pacific Northwest forest, winding through towering evergreens and across rushing streams that carried the melted remnants of ancient glaciers down toward the valleys below. The Tam family had planned this excursion as a special treat, packing a carefully prepared picnic lunch and setting out early in the morning to make the most of their day in the wilderness. Grace Tam, an 11-year-old girl whose intelligence and sweet nature had already made her a favorite among, walked eagerly alongside her parents as they made their way up the familiar trail that thousands of other families had traveled safely before them. The morning air was crisp and clean as the family completed their mile-long hike, their anticipation building with each step as they approached the legendary ice caves that had formed over countless winters through the patient work of freezing water and shifting temperatures. The massive ice formations that awaited them at the trail's end were truly spectacular, creating natural architecture that seemed almost too perfect to be real, with walls of blue-white ice that caught and reflected the filtered sunlight streaming through the forest canopy above. Large yellow warning signs had been posted along the trail and near the cave entrances, their bold lettering clearly stating that visitors should not enter the ice caves themselves due to the inherent dangers of unstable ice formations and the constant risk of falling debris. These warnings were the result of years of experience by park officials who understood that the same natural processes that created the cave's beauty also made them incredibly dangerous, with massive chunks of ice constantly shifting, cracking, and breaking away as temperatures fluctuated throughout the day. The Tam family, like responsible visitors before them, heeded these warnings and chose to admire the ice caves from what they believed was a safe distance outside the entrance, settling down on a large rock formation approximately 15 feet, 4.6 meters, from the cave opening to enjoy their picnic lunch, while taking in the breathtaking view of the frozen formations. Grace sat contentedly between her parents on the rocky outcrop, her young eyes wide with wonder at the natural spectacle before them, completely unaware that high above their heads, invisible forces were already at work that would turn their peaceful moment into a nightmare. The ice formations within the caves were in constant motion, even when they appeared perfectly still to the human eye, as the relentless cycle of freezing and thawing created enormous pressure within the frozen structures that could build for hours or even days before reaching a critical breaking point. Temperature variations throughout the day, combined with the weight of accumulated ice and the natural settling of the formations, created conditions where massive chunks of ice could break away from the cave ceiling or walls with absolutely no warning, transforming from solid architectural elements into deadly projectiles in the space of a heartbeat. On this particular afternoon, as the Tam family enjoyed their lunch and marveled at the natural beauty surrounding them, the stresses within the ice formation above the cave entrance had reached the point of no return, though there was no visible sign of the catastrophe that was about to unfold. The chunk of ice that had been slowly separating from the main formation was enormous, roughly the size of a pickup truck and weighing several tons, suspended high above the cave entrance like a sword hanging by an invisible thread. Without any sound of warning, without any preliminary cracking or shifting that might have alerted the family to move to safety, the massive ice formation suddenly broke free from its moorings and plummeted toward the earth with the unstoppable force of gravity, its trajectory carrying it directly toward the spot where Grace sat peacefully with her parents. The little girl had no time to react, no opportunity to move out of the way, no chance to escape the path of the falling ice that would crush her young life in an instant. The sound of the impact was tremendous, a sickening crash that echoed through the forest and brought the family's perfect day to an abrupt and horrifying end, as Grace disappeared beneath tons of ice that had fallen from the cave formation above. Her parents, sitting just inches away, were suddenly faced with every parent's worst nightmare, as they realized that their daughter had been struck by the massive chunk of ice and was trapped beneath its crushing weight. The immediate aftermath of the accident revealed both the best and worst aspects of human nature, as complete strangers who had been visiting the ice caves that day immediately rushed to help, abandoning their own recreational activities to assist in what everyone hoped against hope might still be a rescue operation. These Good Samaritans began performing CPR on Grace, even as it became apparent that her injuries were catastrophic, their desperate efforts to save her life continuing even when the situation seemed hopeless. While some visitors worked frantically to provide medical assistance to the gravely injured child, others made the difficult decision to leave the scene and run back down the mile-long trail toward the parking area, knowing that their only hope of getting professional help lay in reaching a location where cell phone service was available. The remote location of the Big Four ice caves meant that cellular coverage was non-existent at the trailhead, forcing the would-be rescuers to drive an additional 7 miles, 11.3 kilometers, down winding mountain roads before they could establish contact with emergency services. The communication with rescue services began a race against time that was ultimately doomed from the start, as the remote location of the accident scene and the difficulty of transporting emergency medical equipment up the mile-long hiking trail created logistical challenges that would have tested even the most efficient rescue operation. Professional rescue workers faced the daunting task of carrying specialized medical equipment and stretchers up a trail that was never designed for emergency vehicle access. Their progress slowed by the rough terrain and the urgent need to reach the accident scene as quickly as possible. 2 hours and 20 minutes passed between the moment of impact and the arrival of professional rescue personnel at the Big Four ice caves. An eternity for the family members and strangers who continued their desperate efforts to save Grace's life throughout that agonizing period. Despite the heroic efforts of everyone involved, both the immediate volunteers who provided CPR and the professional rescue workers who eventually reached the scene, Grace Tam succumbed to the crushing pelvic injuries she had sustained when the massive chunk of ice fell on her small body. The medical examination that followed confirmed what had been apparent from the moment of impact. Grace had suffered injuries that were simply incompatible with life, her small frame unable to withstand the tremendous force of several tons of ice falling from the height of the cave formation above. The 11-year-old girl who had begun the day with such excitement and anticipation, looking forward to seeing one of nature's most spectacular displays, had become the victim of the same natural forces that created the beauty she had come to admire. The aftermath of Grace Tam's death sent shockwaves through the hiking and outdoor recreation community, raising serious questions about the safety measures in place at popular natural attractions and the adequacy of warning systems designed to protect visitors from the inherent dangers of unstable natural formations. Grace's father, Eric Tam, channeled his grief into advocacy, pressing park officials and government agencies to implement enhanced safety measures that might prevent other families from experiencing the same devastation. The tragedy at Big Four ice caves serves as a stark reminder that nature's beauty often comes with hidden dangers that can turn deadly without warning, and that even the most careful and responsible visitors can find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time when natural forces decide to unleash their power. Grace Tam's death was not the result of reckless behavior or ignoring safety warnings. She and her family had followed all posted guidelines and maintained what they believed was a safe distance from the ice caves themselves. The investigation into the accident revealed that falling ice and rock around cave entrances is a constant concern at such locations, with the natural processes of freezing, thawing, and structural stress creating conditions where massive chunks can break away at any time without warning. The large yellow signs posted along the trail, warning visitors not to enter the caves, were designed to prevent people from venturing into the most dangerous areas. But they could not account for the possibility that deadly debris might fall well outside. On July 18, 1998, Vittoria Balsi, a 32-year-old woman with a sense of adventure but limited technical caving experience, visited the Moaning Caverns, not knowing how deadly dangers were creeping their way towards her. Moaning Cavern in California had built its reputation as a premier destination for adventure seekers, offering tourists the unique thrill of rappelling down a massive 180-foot, 54.9 meters, vertical shaft that served as the natural entrance to the underground cave system. The commercial operation marketed this extreme experience as safe and accessible to beginners, drawing visitors from across the country who wanted to experience the rush of descending into the earth on a rope while surrounded by the ancient limestone walls of one of nature's most spectacular underground chambers. Bossie had been drawn to Moaning Cavern twice before, making her first descent in the early 1990s and returning once more in 1994 to experience the unique thrill of rappelling into the cave's depths. These two previous visits represented the complete extent of her rappelling experience, making her exactly the type of novice adventurer that commercial cave operations claimed they could safely accommodate with proper equipment and basic instruction. 4 years had passed since Bossie's last visit to the cave, and as she stood at the edge of the massive pit entrance on that fateful July morning, she was about to discover that the combination of rusty skills, inadequate equipment, and insufficient safety protocols could transform an exciting adventure into a deadly freefall. The cavern employees fitted her with a standard harness and rappel device, running through the basic procedures for controlling her descent while emphasizing the importance of maintaining steady pressure on the rope to regulate her speed as she lowered herself into the cave. The rappelling setup at Moaning Cavern was designed to allow tourists to experience the thrill of descending the full 180-foot shaft, with the first 60 feet consisting of a sloped approach to the lip of the pit, followed by a terrifying 120-foot, 36.6 meters free-fall drop, where rappellers would dangle completely free in the air above the cave floor below. This design meant that tourists would experience a gradual introduction to the rappelling process before committing to the most dangerous portion of the descent. But it also meant that once they reached the lip of the pit, there would be no turning back. As Bossie began backing down the sloped approach toward the edge of the pit, her rappel device was supposed to provide enough friction against the rope to allow her to control her descent speed by adjusting the pressure she applied to the rope below the device. However, almost immediately after beginning her descent, she noticed that something felt wrong with the equipment and that her rappel was proceeding much faster than it should have been, creating a growing sense of panic as she realized she was losing control of her descent. The sensation of moving too quickly down the rope triggered Bossie's survival instincts, and she called out for help to the cavern employees who were stationed at the top of the pit to supervise the rappelling operation. Her desperate calls for assistance should have been the first warning sign that something was seriously wrong with either the equipment or the setup. But in the confusion and noise around the pit entrance, none of the employees heard her cries for help, leaving her to face the growing crisis alone as she continued her uncontrolled descent toward the lip of the pit. Faced with the terrifying realization that she was losing control of her rappel just as she approached the most dangerous portion of the descent, Bossie made a critical decision that would prove to be both understandable and tragically wrong. Rather than trusting her instincts that something was dangerously wrong with her equipment, she convinced herself that her fear was simply the result of being out of practice after 4 years away from rappelling, and she made the fateful choice to continue her descent instead of demanding immediate assistance from the surface. The moment Bossie went over the lip of the pit and her full body weight transferred onto the rappel device, the inadequate friction became catastrophically apparent. Her device failed to generate enough resistance against the rope, and she immediately began accelerating downward in an uncontrolled fall toward the cave floor 120 feet, 36.6 meters below. Bossie desperately tried to regain control by gripping the rope below the device and pulling as she had been instructed, but nothing could stop her deadly plunge. An employee at the bottom noticed her uncontrolled descent and tried to provide an emergency belay by pulling on the rope, but it was too late to overcome the momentum of her accelerating fall. The sickening impact of Bossie's body against the limestone cave wall was followed by the terrible sound of her hitting the cave floor, her body absorbing the full force of a fall that should never have happened. The injuries were devastating: a fractured skull, 2 broken vertebrae in her neck, and a fractured ankle. The cave employee who witnessed Bossie's impact immediately recognized the severity of her injuries and made the crucial decision to prevent her from sitting up or moving, understanding that any movement could potentially worsen spinal injuries and transform survivable trauma into permanent paralysis or death. As Bossie lay motionless on the floor, waves of excruciating pain radiated through her broken body. Every breath sent sharp agony through her fractured skull, while the slightest attempt to move her head triggered stabbing sensations down her spine where 2 vertebrae had snapped. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth, and through her blurred vision, she could see concerned faces hovering above her in the dim cave lighting. The rescue operation that followed highlighted both the challenges of providing emergency medical care in remote underground locations and the dedication of professional rescue teams who regularly risk their own safety to help others. The process of moving Bossy from the cave floor to the surface required the rescue team to secure her in a specialized litter designed for vertical rescue operations, then carefully transport her up the long spiral staircase that provided the only alternative route out of the cave system. Every movement sent lightning bolts of pain through her damaged spine. The journey up the spiral staircase became a hellish ordeal of jolting sensations, and the constant fear that one wrong step by her rescuers could sever her spinal cord completely. Each bump and shift of the litter made her cry out in agony, her broken body protesting every moment of the painstaking evacuation. Once the rescue team successfully brought Bossy to the surface, she was immediately transferred to a waiting helicopter for rapid transport to a hospital equipped to handle her severe injuries. Time was a critical factor in providing the specialized medical care that would determine whether she would survive the accident and, if so, whether she would suffer permanent disability as a result of her injuries. Hospital X-rays revealed the full extent of Bossy's injuries: a fractured skull, 2 broken vertebrae in her neck, and a shattered ankle. Fortunately, her spinal cord remained undamaged, and it was a miracle considering how close Bossy had come to suffering permanent paralysis or death. And medical professionals credited the quick thinking of the cave employee who prevented her from moving after the fall, with potentially saving her from far worse consequences. The investigation into the accident exposed fundamental problems with using a 180-foot, 54.9 meters, vertical pit as a training ground for inexperienced rappellers, as experts later noted that such an extreme environment was completely inappropriate for beginners who lacked the skills and experience necessary to handle equipment failures or other emergency situations. 28-year-old Sum Bora belonged to a brotherhood of specialized harvesters who ventured into the darkest recesses of Chakrai Mountain, not for adventure or exploration, but for survival itself. His goal was to collect guano, bat excrement that had accumulated in thick, pungent layers over decades. While Western farmers relied on industrial fertilizers costing hundreds of dollars per ton, Cambodian agriculturalists like Bora harvested this natural alternative that contained essential nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium at a fraction of the cost. The mathematics of rural Cambodian farming made guano collection not just economical, but essential. A single cave expedition could yield enough fertilizer to sustain a family farm for months, transforming subsistence agriculture into profitable cultivation. However, the richest deposits lay in the most treacherous locations, narrow passages where few dared to venture, and where experienced collectors like Bora held distinct advantages. At 5 feet 6 inches, 168 centimeters, tall and weighing approximately 130 pounds, 59 kilograms, Bora possessed the ideal physical dimensions for navigating the cramped cave systems that honeycombed Chakrai Mountain. His slender frame allowed him to squeeze through openings that blocked larger men, accessing guano deposits that remained untouched by other collectors. Over several years, he had built a reputation as one of the region's most skilled harvesters, capable of remaining underground for days while mapping new passages and locating the richest accumulations. On that fateful August morning of 2019, Bora prepared for what he anticipated would be a routine 3-day expedition. He packed his essential equipment: a battery-powered flashlight, water containers, dried rice, and cloth sacks for transporting the guano. The temperature outside reached 95 degrees Fahrenheit, 35 degrees Celsius, but deep within the caves, temperatures would drop to a steady 75 degrees Fahrenheit, 24 degrees Celsius, cool enough to require long sleeves but comfortable for extended physical labor. Chakrai Mountain's cave system extended over 2 miles, 3.2 kilometers, through the limestone formation, with passages ranging from cathedral-sized chambers to crawlways barely 12 inches high. The main entrance, located 800 feet, 244 meters above sea level, descended through a series of natural corridors that gradually narrowed as they penetrated deeper into the mountain. Most collectors never ventured beyond the first 500 feet, 152 meters, where easily accessible guano could be harvested without significant risk. Bora's destination lay much deeper, a series of narrow passages where massive bat colonies roosted undisturbed. As he descended through the familiar limestone corridors, his flashlight beam revealed the telltale signs of his goal: dark stains coating the walls and the distinctive ammonia odor that intensified with each step deeper into the mountain. The sound of thousands of bat wings created a constant rustling echo that reverberated through the passages. Approximately 1,200 feet, 366 meters from the entrance, Bora encountered the passage which would soon become his nightmare. The corridor, measuring roughly 3 feet, 0.9 meters wide, and 4 feet, 1.2 meters high, required crawling on hands and knees. Ahead, his flashlight illuminated what appeared to be moving walls, thousands of bats clinging to the limestone surfaces. The narrowest section of the passage featured a 6-inch, 15-centimeter, wide crevice that dropped vertically into darkness. This crack in the limestone floor had been created by ancient water erosion and extended downward for an unknown distance, potentially hundreds of feet into the mountain's depths. Experienced cave explorers would have recognized such features as deadly traps. But Bora was a harvester, not a spelunker, and his focus remained on the valuable guano deposits surrounding the bat colony. While maneuvering around the narrow crevice, Bora's flashlight slipped from his grasp and tumbled into the crack. The light disappeared into the depths, leaving him in absolute darkness, a blackness so complete that his eyes could not adjust or distinguish any shapes or directions. Without hesitation, Bora attempted to retrieve the flashlight. Lying prone on the limestone floor, he reached into the crevice, feeling along the rough walls for any ledge where the light might have lodged. The opening was narrow enough that he could span it with his arms, but deep enough that his flashlight had vanished completely. Stretching further into the crack, he shifted his weight forward to extend his reach. Disaster struck in a split second of carelessness. The limestone walls, polished smooth by centuries of water flow, offered no purchase for his hands or feet. As Bora leaned deeper into the crevice, gravity took control. He slipped forward, his shoulders and chest sliding into the narrow opening until he became wedged between the walls. The 6-inch, 15-centimeter width at the top gradually narrowed as it descended, creating a natural funnel that trapped him at chest level while his legs remained on the cave floor above. His initial attempts at escape revealed the horrifying physics of his predicament. The limestone walls pressed against his ribcage with increasing pressure as he moved, and any attempt to push upward only wedged him more firmly into the narrowing crevice. His arms, trapped at his sides, had limited mobility to assist in freeing himself. The smooth walls provided no handholds, and the weight of his body worked against any upward movement. Hours passed in absolute darkness. Bora's voice echoed through the empty passages as he called for help, knowing that no other collectors were likely to venture this deep into the cave system. The temperature remained constant, but his immobilized position prevented normal blood circulation, and cold began to seep into his extremities. Without access to his water supply, which remained in his pack on the cave floor above, dehydration became an immediate concern. The psychological impact of his situation was perhaps more devastating than the physical discomfort. Bora faced the terrifying realization that he might die alone in absolute darkness, wedged in a crack barely wider than his body, with no possibility of rescue. As the first day dissolved into night, though darkness made the distinction meaningless, Bora's physical condition began to deteriorate. Muscle cramps from his awkward position intensified, and the constant pressure against his chest made breathing increasingly difficult. His initial optimism that someone would search for him gradually gave way to despair as he calculated the unlikely odds of rescue. The clock kept ticking, and days passed by, with Bora wedged in the same motionless position without being able to get out. The second day brought new levels of misery. Dehydration caused severe headaches and confusion, while his immobilized position led to circulation problems in his legs and arms. The limestone walls seemed to press more tightly against his body, though this was likely a psychological response to his deteriorating physical condition. His calls for help became weaker and less frequent, as he conserved energy and faced the growing certainty of death. By the third day, Bora had descended into a psychological state that bordered on complete despair. He seriously started considering suicide as a preferable alternative to the slow agony of starvation and dehydration. The absolute darkness and silence had begun to affect his mental state, causing hallucinations and distorted perceptions of time. He found himself wishing for death as a release from the unbearable physical and psychological torture. Meanwhile, 12 miles, 19 kilometers away in his village, Bora's family had begun to worry. While his 3-day expeditions were common, he was meticulous about returning when promised. His brother, also experienced in guano collection, remembered Bora mentioning Chakrai Mountain as a potential destination. On the 4th day, he organized a search party and headed toward the mountain. The search began at the main cave entrance, where fresh footprints in the mud confirmed that someone had recently entered the system. Following the established paths used by guano collectors, the search party penetrated deeper into the cave than most visitors ever ventured. Approximately 1,000 feet, 305 meters into the cave system, Bora's brother heard something that stopped him cold, a faint human cry echoing from the depths. The sound was barely audible above the constant rustling of bat wings, but unmistakably human. Following the sound, he crawled through the narrow passage until he reached the fatal crevice. Looking down into the crack, his flashlight beam revealed a sight that would haunt him forever. His brother's head and shoulders wedged tightly in the narrow opening, suspended over a drop that disappeared into darkness below. Bora was conscious but barely responsive, his voice reduced to a weak whisper after 4 days without food or water. The rescue would require far more resources than a family search party could provide. The brothers' emergency call to local authorities triggered the largest cave rescue operation in Battambang Province's history. Over 200 rescuers assembled at Chakrai Mountain, including police officers, firefighters, medical personnel, and experienced cavers from across the region. The rescue presented unprecedented technical challenges, extracting a person wedged in a 6-inch, 15-centimeter crevice located over 1,200 feet, 366 meters, inside a cave system. The 10-hour rescue operation required careful coordination between multiple teams working in shifts. Rescuers had to widen the crevice using hand tools, carefully chipping away limestone without destabilizing the surrounding rock or injuring the victim. Medical personnel established a supply line to provide intravenous fluids and pain medication while the extraction continued. Communication between the victim and rescuers was maintained through a relay system of volunteers positioned throughout the narrow passage. Finally, after 4 days and 17 hours of entrapment, Bora was pulled free from the limestone crevice that had nearly become his grave. He was immediately transported to Battambang Provincial Hospital, where medical examination revealed dehydration, muscle damage from prolonged immobilization, and minor injuries to his head, chest, and knees. Remarkably, he had avoided serious long-term physical damage, though the psychological impact would require months of recovery. In interviews following his rescue, Bora admitted that he had reached such depths of despair that he would have taken his own life if he had possessed the means. The experience had broken his spirit completely, leaving him convinced that death was preferable to the ongoing agony of his situation. His survival was attributed not to hope or determination, but to the simple fact that he lacked any method of ending his suffering. On a Sunday afternoon in January 19, 2025, the limestone caves of North Yorkshire's Ribblesdale became the scene of a tragic accident that would remind the caving community of the inherent dangers present in their beloved underground world. What began as a routine exploration of Dick and Pot, a well-known cave system near Sellside, turned into a disaster real quick. Dick and Pot sits within the extensive cave network that includes Long Churn Cave and Alum Pot, forming part of one of Yorkshire's most significant underground systems. Located in the limestone-rich landscape of Horton and Ribblesdale, this area has long attracted cavers from across Britain and beyond, drawn by its deep pitches, complex passages, and challenging technical requirements. The cave system's first pitch presents an immediate challenge to those entering, a vertical drop of 100 feet, 30 meters, that requires proper rope work and careful technique. Unlike some cave entrances where visibility allows surface observers to monitor descending cavers, Dick and Pot's configuration includes a traverse that effectively blinds those at the surface to what lies below. January 19, 2025, was a cold winter day in the Yorkshire Dales, perfect for outdoor activities. A group of experienced cave explorers met that morning, knowing both the joys and dangers of exploring caves. Winter cave trips need extra planning because the daylight hours are shorter, the surface conditions can be more difficult, and staying warm underground becomes very important. The group walked toward Dick and Pot and began their usual safety checks before going down. They checked their equipment, looked at their ropes carefully, and adjusted their harnesses with great care because this attention to detail keeps cavers safe. The limestone cave entrance opened before them like a giant mouth, promising both adventure and challenge. Getting to the first pitch required careful walking and complete focus, as each step along the limestone ledges had to be planned and secure. This cave system had a special design, where once a spelunker started the traverse and began going down, they would disappear from sight of their teammates above. The person going down would vanish into the rocky depths with only the rope connecting them to the world above. At 12:27 in the afternoon, the important moment came as the group took their positions around the first pitch of Dick and Pot. Each person had a job in this carefully planned descent, while the caver going down did his final equipment checks and tested his rappelling device. He felt the usual mix of excitement and respect that always comes before dropping into a 100-foot, 30-meter hole carved from solid limestone. The rope stretched tight over the edge and disappeared into the darkness below, while the team members above stayed in their positions, listening for calls that would show progress. They watched the rope for small movements that told them their friend was making his way down safely. The cave seemed to swallow both light and sound, creating a feeling of tension as talking became harder with each foot of the descent. Minutes passed slowly with that stretched feeling of time that happens during technical cave work. The person going down focused completely on his technique, controlling how fast he went down and checking his anchor points to keep his movement smooth and controlled. Above, his teammates waited with special alertness as they watched over someone whose life depended on their attention. Then, without any warning, everything changed when a loud bang suddenly broke the quiet, with a sound that was strong and clear. The team members above heard it easily as it cut through the cave's natural sound patterns like a sharp knife through silence. In the confined acoustic environment of a cave system, sounds can be amplified, distorted, or muffled depending on the specific geological configurations, but the group recognized immediately that something was wrong. When the team members above attempted to communicate with their colleague below, they were met with silence. Their next action followed standard cave rescue protocols. They tested the rope system to assess the situation. What they discovered was deeply concerning. The rope had become taut, suggesting that their teammate might be suspended on the line, potentially injured, and unable to respond to their calls. The configuration of Dick and Pot, with its traverse preventing direct visual contact with the pitch bottom, meant that the surface team could not quickly assess their colleague's condition. This limitation, while a natural feature of the cave, created additional urgency in an already critical situation. Without being able to see what had occurred, the team faced the challenging decision of whether to attempt an immediate rescue descent or to call for professional assistance. Understanding their limitations and the potential severity of the situation, the group made the crucial decision to call for help from CRO. The Cave Rescue Organization represents one of Britain's most specialized and capable volunteer rescue services. These teams combine technical ropework expertise, medical training, and intimate knowledge of local cave systems to respond to incidents that would challenge even professional emergency services. When the call came in from Dick and Pot, CRO members would have immediately begun mobilizing both personnel and the specialized equipment needed for a potential technical rescue from depth. The rescue team arrived carrying heavy rescue packs filled with ropes, pulleys, stretchers, and medical supplies needed for deep cave rescues. At the cave entrance, the rescuers quickly set up their rope systems. They drove strong metal anchors into the limestone rock and tested each connection carefully. The rescue team leader rappelled down the 100-foot pitch first, carrying a headlamp that cut through the complete darkness below. His light beams swept across the cave floor as he descended, searching for any sign of the missing caver. When the rescuer reached the bottom, his worst fears were confirmed. The caver lay motionless on the rocky floor where he had fallen. The rescue team member immediately checked for a pulse, listened for breathing, and looked for any signs of life, but found none. Using his radio, he called up to his teammates above with the devastating news. More rescue team members rappelled down to help. They worked together to carefully move the explorer onto a special rescue stretcher designed for caves. The stretcher had to be secured tightly because it would need to be hauled straight up through the narrow cave opening. The team attached multiple ropes to the stretcher and connected it to a powerful pulley system they had set up at the surface. The most difficult part came next, lifting the stretcher 100 feet 30 meters, straight up through the cave. Team members at the surface pulled on the ropes while others guided the stretcher to prevent it from hitting the cave walls. The process took hours of careful, steady work. Every few feet, they had to stop and adjust the ropes to make sure the stretcher stayed level and secure. Finally, after many hours of exhausting work, the rescue team successfully brought the caver to the surface. Yorkshire Ambulance Service paramedics were waiting there, but they could only confirm what the rescue team already knew, that nothing could be done to save him. The 170 volunteer hours logged for this incident reflect not just the immediate response and recovery operation, but the comprehensive nature of cave rescue work. These hours encompass the initial call-out and travel time, the technical work of accessing and recovering the casualty, the coordination with other emergency services including Yorkshire Ambulance Service, YAS, paramedics. The Cave Rescue Organization's statement that they hoped the deceased's family will find comfort in the fact that he was doing what he enjoyed so much speaks to a fundamental aspect of high-risk recreational activities. Those who choose to explore caves do so, knowing the risks involved, driven by passion for discovery, challenge, and the unique experiences that underground exploration provides. January 8, 1995, dawned crisp and clear in the mountains of Tennessee. 25-year-old Clinton Farrell had no idea that this seemingly ordinary Sunday morning would become hours of nightmare. Clinton and his friend had heard stories about Cookston Cave from locals in the area. Rumors persisted of Civil War artifacts hidden deep within the limestone caverns, treasures left behind by soldiers who had used the cave as shelter during the conflict over a century earlier. The two young men, neither experienced cavers, decided to explore the cave system in search of historical artifacts that could make them rich. Their preparation for this underground adventure was dangerously inadequate. Both men wore street clothes and cowboy boots, footwear completely unsuitable for navigating wet, slippery cave floors. They carried no helmets, no proper lighting equipment, and none of the safety gear that experienced cavers consider essential. Their only light source were basic flashlights purchased from a local hardware store. The entrance to Cookston Cave yawned before them like a dark mouth in the Tennessee hillside. The limestone formation had been carved by underground water systems over thousands of years, creating a complex network of passages, chambers, and tight crawlways. What appeared to be a simple cave entrance actually led to miles of interconnected tunnels that had claimed the lives of unprepared explorers before. Clinton and his friend descended into the cave system with the confidence of youth and the ignorance of inexperience. The main passage sloped downward at a gentle angle, making their initial progress seem deceptively easy. Moisture dripped from the ceiling, and their breath formed clouds in the cool air that maintained constant temperature year-round. As they ventured deeper into the cave, the passage began to narrow and curve upward in a section that experienced cavers would recognize as geologically unstable. The walls showed signs of previous rockfalls, with loose debris scattered across the cave floor. Warning signs that trained cavers would have immediately recognized were invisible to the two artifact hunters. Clinton squeezed through a particularly tight section where the horizontal crawlway curved sharply upward. The passage forced him to contort his body, with his head pressed against one wall while his torso followed the natural curve of the limestone formation. His legs remained stretched out behind him in the lower horizontal section, creating the exact body position that would prove nearly fatal within minutes. The rock that would change Clinton's life forever had been shifting for decades. Geological stress from freeze-thaw cycles, water infiltration, and the natural settling of the cave system had gradually loosened a massive limestone boulder weighing approximately 500 pounds or 227 kilograms. The rock hung precariously above the narrow passage, held in place by increasingly unstable support points. As Clinton maneuvered through the tight space, searching the walls for any sign of historical artifacts, his movement created just enough vibration to trigger the geological disaster that had been building for years. The massive boulder shifted with a grinding sound that echoed through the cave like a death knell. The 500-pound rock moved with devastating speed and precision, pinning Clinton's head against the cave wall with crushing force. The impact was instantaneous and horrifying, trapping him in a position where any movement could cause additional rocks to fall or increase the pressure on his already compressed skull. Clinton's friend heard the terrible sound of shifting rock, followed by a scream that was quickly muffled by the stone prison that now held his companion. The sight that greeted him when he reached Clinton's position would haunt him for the rest of his life. His friend was trapped with his head pinned against the wall by a boulder larger than a refrigerator, conscious but unable to move without risking further injury. The friend's decision to leave Clinton alone in the cave and seek help was both brave and terrifying. He had to navigate back through the dangerous cave system in near darkness, then find his way to the nearest phone to contact emergency services. Every minute that passed increased the risk that Clinton would succumb to his injuries, or that additional rocks would shift and crush him completely. Above ground, the call for help triggered one of the most complex cave rescue operations in Tennessee history. Personnel from both Sequatchie and Hamilton County rescue teams responded to the emergency, bringing specialized equipment designed for underground extraction operations. These weren't ordinary first responders. They were trained cave rescue specialists who understood the unique challenges of underground emergencies. The rescue team faced a nightmare scenario as they descended into Cookston Cave. Their victim was trapped 200 feet inside a narrow passage, pinned by a 500-pound boulder in a geologically unstable area where any disturbance could trigger additional rock falls. The confined space made it impossible to bring in heavy equipment, meaning they would have to rely on manual tools and human ingenuity. Underground, Clinton fought to remain conscious as the crushing pressure on his head created waves of pain and disorientation. The position of his body, bent at an unnatural angle in the curve of the passage, restricted his breathing and circulation. Hypothermia became an additional threat as his body temperature began dropping in the constant cave environment. The rescue team worked with surgical precision to stabilize both Clinton and the massive boulder that held him captive. Using a technique called shoring, they installed supports around the unstable rock to prevent any additional movement that could prove fatal. Every action had to be calculated and deliberate, as one wrong move could bring down additional tons of limestone. The solution to Clinton's predicament came in the form of a come-along, a mechanical device that uses cables and pulleys to move heavy objects with controlled force. The rescue team carefully positioned the come-along to apply pressure to the boulder at precisely the right angle, gradually shifting the massive rock away from Clinton's trapped head. The process was agonizingly slow and dangerous. Each adjustment of the come-along had to be monitored for any signs that the boulder might shift in an unexpected direction. The rescue team worked in shifts, maintaining constant vigilance over both their equipment and the victim who had been trapped for nearly 5 hours. When the boulder finally moved enough to free Clinton's head, the rescue was far from over. His injuries were severe, and extracting him from the narrow cave passage required specialized techniques to prevent further damage to his compressed spine and skull. The rescue team carefully immobilized Clinton in a specialized litter designed for cave evacuations. The journey to the cave entrance became another ordeal as rescuers navigated the narrow passages while carrying their injured patient. The horizontal crawlway that had nearly claimed Clinton's life now became an obstacle course for the rescue team, who had to move with extreme care to avoid jarring their patient or becoming trapped themselves. Once outside the cave, Clinton faced another challenge: the 100-foot slope that led from the cave entrance to the nearest road, where emergency vehicles waited. The rescue team used rope systems and manual hauling techniques to carry Clinton up the steep, rocky terrain while maintaining the stability needed to protect his injuries. A medical helicopter waited at the top of the slope, its rotors turning as paramedics prepared Clinton for immediate transport to the nearest trauma center. After nearly 6 hours of underground imprisonment and complex rescue operations, Clinton was finally on his way to definitive medical care. At the hospital, doctors discovered the full extent of Clinton's injuries from his encounter with 500 pounds of limestone. He was listed in critical condition with severe head trauma, but medical professionals expressed cautious optimism about his chances for recovery. The human skull had proven remarkably resilient, and Clinton's youth worked in his favor. The Cookston Cave incident became a watershed moment for cave safety in Tennessee. The cave was immediately closed to public access, and the rescue operation became a case study in both the dangers of unprepared cave exploration and the heroic efforts of volunteer rescue teams. Clinton's recovery took months of rehabilitation, but he did survive his ordeal. The young artifact hunter had learned the hard way that caves demand respect, proper equipment, and extensive training. His story became a cautionary tale told to anyone considering casual cave exploration. It's a Saturday night in August 2020 in Oslo, Norway. And above the busy streets, people are heading home early. Bars close at midnight because of new coronavirus rules. Young people scroll through their phones, bored and restless. But deep beneath their feet, in a place forgotten by time, something incredible and incredibly dangerous is about to happen. 70 meters straight down, 229 feet, buried deeper than a 20-story building is tall, sits a massive concrete cave. This isn't any ordinary cave. It's a bunker built decades ago to protect people during dangerous times. Imagine a space bigger than 2 basketball courts, with thick concrete walls that could withstand almost anything. For years, it had been completely sealed off from the world above. But secrets have a way of surfacing. 3 weeks before that fateful night, a message began spreading through social media like wildfire. It wasn't posted on public pages or shared openly. Instead, it moved through private groups, whispered from friend to friend in the digital underground. The message was simple but thrilling. Rave cave, Saturday night. Tell no one. The very name sent shivers of excitement through anyone who heard it. A rave in a cave? It sounded like something from a movie. Dangerous, exciting, and completely unforgettable. But this wasn't just any cave. This was a secret fortress hidden beneath one of Europe's most modern cities. And now, it was the venue for a birthday celebration rave party. The planners knew they were walking on thin ice, but they were making their first critical mistake. The country had strict rules about gatherings, no more than 20 people for private parties, and definitely not the hundreds they were hoping for. Instead of respecting these safety guidelines designed to protect public health, they crafted their plan like master spies, organizing a secret mission. The instructions were specific. Arrive in tiny groups. Start coming at 11 p.m. Don't all show up at once. Don't attract attention. Find the hidden entrance in the St. Hanshaugen area. And whatever you do, don't get caught. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of electric anticipation that makes your heart race. The first ones made their way through Oslo's quiet streets, following cryptic directions to a spot that looked completely ordinary from above. But appearances can be deceiving. Hidden beneath their feet was an entrance no bigger than a crawl space, just 1 square meter, like trying to squeeze through a small window. Wooden boards had been covering this secret doorway, but someone had already pried them away, creating a portal into another world. One by one, adventurous young people began disappearing into the earth. Picture them squeezing through that tiny opening, flashlights in hand, descending into complete darkness. A party needs power, and power needs generators. Here's where the organizers made their second deadly mistake. Diesel generators were wrestled through that narrow entrance, and these generators, they make noise. The organizers set them up in a room in the bunkers, and thinking they were being smart, they found an air shaft and sealed it up tight with plastic bags and duct tape. What they didn't understand was that diesel generators produce carbon monoxide, a deadly gas that needs proper ventilation to escape safely. By sealing the room, they were creating a poison chamber. No noise would escape to alert the world above, but neither would the invisible killer building up inside. It seemed like the perfect plan, but it was actually a death trap waiting to spring. As word spread and more people arrived, something magical began to happen. The cold, empty bunker transformed into a pulsing, living creature of lights and sound. Imagine walking into complete darkness and suddenly being hit by waves of color dancing across ancient concrete walls. This wasn't just any party. This was like stepping into a secret world that existed parallel to the ordinary life happening far above. Cars drove over their heads while below. Nearly 200 people danced in a space that had been designed to hide people from the dangers of war. Now, it was hiding them from the boredom of a world locked down by pandemic rules. The birthday celebration that had sparked this whole adventure became secondary to the pure magic of the moment. Teenagers and 20-somethings who had been stuck at home for months danced like they were celebrating not just a birthday, but their escape from the ordinary world. But even in paradise, there are whispers of trouble, if only people knew how to listen. The third major mistake was happening right in front of everyone, but nobody recognized the warning signs. Some of the sharper partygoers began to notice something strange. The oxygen levels inside the cave started dropping dangerously low. There was no proper ventilation system. The oxygen in the bunker was being consumed by the 200 people dancing. The air felt different, heavier, like breathing through a thick blanket. These were the early symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning: dizziness, difficulty breathing, and the need for fresh air. But instead of recognizing these as danger signals that should have immediately cleared the party, people dismissed them as normal stuffiness. A few people started making trips to that tiny entrance, squeezing through the narrow opening to gasp fresh air under the stars above. One guy found himself climbing out repeatedly throughout the night. Each time he returned to the party, the air seemed thicker, more difficult to breathe. He told himself it was normal. Pack 200 people into any space and the air gets stuffy. This was the fourth mistake, ignoring his body's clear warning signals. What he didn't know was that his frequent trips outside were literally saving his life, while those who stayed inside were slowly being poisoned. Those plastic bags and duct tape that had seemed so clever were working too well. They weren't just keeping sound in, they were keeping something deadly in too. Carbon monoxide, an invisible killer that has no smell, no taste, no warning, was building up to lethal levels just meters away from the dancing crowd. The generators hummed away in their sealed prison, working harder and harder to power the lights and speakers. With every passing minute, they were producing more of the colorless gas that would soon turn paradise into a nightmare. Without any warning whatsoever, the world went black. The lights died, the music stopped. In an instant, 200 people went from dancing in colorful paradise to standing in complete, terrifying darkness. The silence was deafening after hours of pounding music. Confused voices began calling out in the blackness. Then someone found the generator room door and broke it open. Imagine opening a door and being hit by an invisible wall of death. That's exactly what happened. Carbon monoxide rushed out like a silent tsunami, instantly overwhelming anyone in its path. 3 young men standing near the door collapsed unconscious immediately, their bodies simply shutting down as the poison invaded their bloodstream. Other partygoers rushed to help, not understanding what they were running into. They were hit by waves of dizziness and nausea, their vision blurring as they fought to stay conscious. Some managed to grab their unconscious friends and drag them toward the entrance, but they had to keep running back out themselves, gasping for air, their heads spinning. But perhaps the biggest mistake of all was having only one exit. Picture the chaos. 200 people in complete darkness, many of them suddenly sick and confused, all trying to escape through an opening barely big enough for one person. The entrance that had seemed like such an adventure on the way in now became a terrifying bottleneck. In any emergency situation, you need multiple escape routes, but the organizers had chosen a location with just one tiny exit, turning what should have been a quick evacuation into a nightmare of people fainting, stumbling, desperate to reach the surface. Above ground, Oslo police officers were finishing their routine patrol when they spotted something that made them stop. Several young people were wandering the streets, looking lost and confused. They seemed disoriented, like they didn't know where they were or what had happened to them. When the officers approached, the truth came tumbling out. There was an emergency happening beneath their feet. More people were emerging from what looked like nowhere, many of them clearly in desperate need of medical help. At 3:46 a.m. on Sunday morning, the emergency call went out. Fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars raced through the empty streets towards St. Hanshaugen. What they found when they arrived was beyond anything they had trained for. The rescue workers descended into what had become a death trap. The carbon monoxide levels were so high they could have killed a person in minutes. The oxygen level had dropped so low that it was barely enough to keep someone alive. They expected to find dozens of unconscious people scattered throughout the bunker. Miraculously, they found 7 unconscious victims, but most people had managed to escape before the gas could claim them. The fire department worked through the night, using powerful fans to pump fresh air into the bunker, slowly making it safe for rescue operations. 25 people were rushed to Oslo University Hospital, their lives hanging in the balance. 7 were unconscious, their bodies fighting the effects of carbon monoxide poisoning. 5 were in critical condition, so close to death that doctors called their survival a miracle. Even 2 police officers who had helped with the rescue were among those being treated, showing just how dangerous the situation had become, even after the party ended. Carbon monoxide is one of nature's most silent killers. It has no smell, no color, no taste, no way for humans to detect it until it's too late. It works by replacing oxygen in the bloodstream, slowly suffocating people from the inside while they remain completely unaware of what's happening. The doctors treating the victims were amazed that so many had survived. In the sealed bunker, with carbon monoxide levels many times higher than what's considered lethal, it should have been a mass casualty event that would have devastated families across Norway. As news of the incident spread across Norway and around the world, difficult questions began to surface. Questions that revealed even more mistakes in the chain of events. How had nearly 200 people managed to gather in a sealed bunker without authorities knowing? Most importantly, why had police tip-offs about the planned party been ignored? This was perhaps the most tragic mistake of all. The authorities had been warned. People had called the police about the planned illegal gathering, but somehow these warnings fell through the cracks. If the police had acted on these tips, 25 people wouldn't have ended up in the hospital fighting for their lives. 2 people were charged with trespassing and unauthorized use of the bunker, but many felt this was hardly enough for an event that had put so many lives at risk. The religious foundation that owned the bunker quickly distanced themselves from the incident, calling it a serious break-in and denying any responsibility. But perhaps the most haunting question was the simplest. What if someone hadn't broken down that generator room door when they did? What if the party had continued for another hour, or 2, or 3? The carbon monoxide would have eventually leaked out anyway, but by then it might have been too late for anyone to escape. In the days that followed, all 25 victims slowly recovered, though some would carry the effects with them for years to come. The 3 people who had been unconscious the longest were kept for observation, their brush with death serving as a reminder of how quickly celebration can turn to catastrophe. The bunker was sealed once again, but this time with the knowledge of what it had witnessed. The concrete walls that had once protected people from the dangers of war had nearly become their tomb in peacetime. The Rave Cave had almost lived up to its name in the most horrible way imaginable. It was June 2, 2004, when 9 teenagers gathered at the entrance of Tongue River Cave in Wyoming, ready for what they thought would be an easy adventure. Barry Blaha and Dana Herbert, both 16, had convinced their friends to explore the underground cave system that Saturday afternoon. None of them had any real caving experience, but they were confident they could handle whatever waited in the darkness below. The teenagers had brought a collection of cheap flashlights, batteries, and a few headlamps they'd borrowed from camping gear, thinking that would be plenty of illumination for their underground exploration. They had no helmets, no proper caving equipment, and definitely no understanding of how dangerous cave systems could be when things went wrong. The group entered the cave in single file, as they made their way deeper into the mountain's belly, laughing and joking about how cool this was going to be. The main passage was spacious at first, allowing them to walk upright and move around easily, with plenty of room for the entire group to spread out and explore different sections of the cavern. As they ventured deeper into the cave system, the teenagers discovered multiple side passages branching off from the main tunnel. Some passages led to dead ends, so they had to turn back and go discover other ones. In all this time, the cave walls showed signs of water damage and erosion, with loose rocks and unstable sections that should have been warning signs to experienced cave explorers, but the teenagers were too excited to notice the danger. As they ventured deeper, Barry's excitement spiked when he noticed something others had missed. Hidden in the shadows was a narrow crack in the wall that seemed to lead further into the cave system. This wasn't on any map. This could be their discovery. This could make them famous among their friends. The group crowded around the opening, shining their lights into the narrow passage beyond. The walls here were different from the main tunnel. The rock looked fractured and unstable, held together by nothing more than gravity and time. Small stones scattered when touched, but the teenagers saw none of these danger signs. All they saw was adventure. The excitement of youth and the thrill of discovery drove Barry and Dana to push further into this narrowing passage while their friends explored other areas of the cave system. They squeezed through sections that required them to turn sideways, then crawl on their hands and knees, and finally army crawl on their bellies as the passage continued to constrict around them. Their flashlight beams revealed that the tunnel kept going even further. The narrowest section of the passage was barely 45 centimeters, 18 inches wide, and 60 centimeters, 24 inches tall, creating a slot-like opening that would challenge even experienced spelunkers with proper equipment and training. Barry, who was slightly smaller than Dana, had squeezed into this section first, with Dana following close behind him through the claustrophobic space. The walls pressed against them from all sides, and they had to exhale completely just to make any forward progress through the restriction. Barry reached a point where the passage became impossibly tight. The walls closed in so much that he couldn't squeeze his body through no matter how he positioned himself. The smart choice was obvious: turn around and crawl back out. They could explore other parts of the cave. Barry's teenage impatience and determination to continue exploring overrode any caution he might have exercised in the situation, and he decided to try clearing the obstruction by moving some of the smaller rocks out of his way. He managed to work one arm free in the tight space and grabbed a rock about the size of a softball that seemed to be part of the blockage. Without thinking about the consequences or understanding how cave systems worked, he began using this rock as a hammer, striking the larger stones ahead of him in an attempt to break them apart or knock them loose. Growing more desperate by the minute, each impact sent vibrations through the surrounding stone. Dust began raining down from the ceiling above them. The cave system had stood for thousands of years, but it had never been attacked like this. The fractured rock formation was held in place by a delicate balance. Each blow from Barry's makeshift hammer was disturbing that balance, sending stress waves through the unstable ceiling above. What happened next was every spelunker's worst nightmare. A deep, thunderous crack echoed through the passage. The sound was followed immediately by the grinding of shifting stones. A massive boulder, later estimated at over 300 pounds, 136 kilograms, broke free from the ceiling and crashed down directly behind Dana. The impact was devastating. The entire passage shook violently. A choking cloud of dust and debris filled the air. When the dust finally settled and the echoes faded, the horrible truth became clear. The fallen boulder had completely sealed the passage behind them. Barry and Dana were trapped in a space barely larger than a coffin. The claustrophobic nightmare that followed was beyond human endurance. Barry found himself pressed against the narrowest section of the passage, his chest compressed so tightly that every breath was a struggle. Behind him, Dana was wedged between his feet and the massive boulder that had become their prison wall. Her breathing became rapid and shallow as panic consumed her. When they turned off their flashlights to save battery, the darkness was absolute. The silence was broken only by their labored breathing and the distant muffled shouts of their friends on the other side of the boulder. They were buried alive, surrounded by tons of rock that could shift and crush them at any moment. Their friends immediately tried to move the boulder, but their efforts were hopeless. The stone might as well have been part of the mountain itself. Their desperate attempts to dig around it only highlighted how impossible the situation had become. Every scraping sound and frustrated shout added to the psychological torture of the trapped teens. Minutes crawled by like hours. The hard stone pressed into their bodies at every point, cutting off circulation and creating agonizing pressure. The air in their tiny prison grew stale and warm from their breathing. Each breath felt insufficient. Muscle cramps set in from forced immobility, adding another layer of suffering. The psychological effects were worse than the physical pain. Thousands of tons of rock pressed down above them. Every small sound became terrifying in their heightened state of fear. The settling of stones, the drip of water, the scurrying of unseen creatures. Time lost all meaning in the absolute darkness. They began to wonder if they would die here, their bodies never to be found. Their friends made the critical decision to race back through the cave system to get help. Several of them ran to the surface and immediately called emergency services. The call went out to Sheridan County rescue personnel, who began mobilizing specialized equipment for what they knew would be a difficult operation. The rescue effort was a battle against time and physics. Professional rescuers arrived with powerful winches, hydraulic jacks, and specialized tools designed for cave emergencies. But even with professional equipment, moving a 300-pound boulder in a narrow cave passage presented enormous challenges. Rescuers had to work in shifts, with only 1 or 2 people able to access the work area at a time. Every tool had to be carried through the cave system by hand. There was constant fear that their efforts might trigger another rockfall that would make the situation even worse. The unstable rock formation meant every movement had to be carefully calculated. Hours passed. The rescue became a race against death. The longer Barry and Dana remained trapped, the greater the risk of serious medical complications from compression and restricted breathing. Hypothermia was also a threat, as the cave's constant cool temperature could quickly lower their body temperatures to dangerous levels. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the rescuers positioned their winch system to move the massive boulder. The operation required precise coordination and extreme care to avoid destabilizing the surrounding rocks. Slowly, inch by terrifying inch, the 300-pound stone was pulled away from the passage. The moment Barry and Dana could finally move again was indescribable relief mixed with agony. Their muscles, cramped from hours of immobility, barely functioned as they were carefully extracted from the narrow passage. The journey back through the cave system felt like being reborn, each step taking them further from their underground nightmare. They emerged from Tongue River Cave at approximately 10:30 p.m., nearly 8 hours after entering what they thought would be a simple afternoon adventure. In the darkness before dawn, on April 24, 1930, deadly gas was about to seep through the limestone corridors of Howe Caverns, turning a routine morning into a nightmare that would expose the dangerous consequences of industrial negligence. The silence of the New York hills was broken as workers at the North American cement company Quarry prepared their biggest blast of the season, a massive detonation that would unleash forces beyond their control. 7.5 tons of dynamite lay packed into carefully drilled holes, ready to blast away 60,000 tons of limestone from the hillside. At exactly 5 in the morning, the earth shook with tremendous violence as the explosive charge erupted with a thunderclap that could be heard for miles, sending shockwaves through the bedrock and creating a network of hairline cracks that spread through the limestone formations like spider webs, reaching toward the cave system below. The quarry workers, satisfied with their successful blast, had no idea that their explosion had just opened pathways for something far more dangerous than falling rock. Owen Wallace, the 27-year-old chief electrician who kept the cavern's lighting system working perfectly for the thousands of visitors who went underground each year, arrived at work with no sense of the deadly danger that was entering his workplace. With him walked John Sagendorf, a 45-year-old company secretary whose commitment to the cavern went far beyond his office duties, often bringing him into the depths alongside the technical staff to make sure every part of the operation met the highest standards. The two men entered the elevator that would take them into what they thought was the safe, familiar environment of the tourist cave, completely unaware that the very air they were about to breathe had been contaminated by the morning's quarry blast. Deep within the cracked limestone, poisonous gases began their silent journey through newly created fissures, seeping through tiny cracks and following the natural shape of the rock formations as they moved toward the vast network of chambers that made up Howe Caverns. Carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, and other lethal compounds that had been trapped within the rock for thousands of years were now free to flow like an invisible stream through the underground passages where tourists had admired nature's beauty just hours before. As the elevator dropped through the natural shaft that connected the surface to the underground chambers, the invisible gases were already moving through the limestone corridors, following air currents and natural ventilation patterns that would guide them directly toward the areas where Wallace and Sagendorf would be working. The Bell of Moscow Formation, a spectacular limestone structure that had become one of the cavern's most popular attractions, stood in the chamber where the two men began their routine maintenance work, its natural beauty hiding the deadly atmosphere that was slowly building around them. The gases moved steadily through the cave system, flowing along the floor of passages and collecting in low areas where they would remain undetected until it was too late. Wallace worked on the electrical connections that powered the lights illuminating the formations, while Sagendorf checked the walkways and safety barriers that protected visitors from the cave's natural hazards, neither man noticing the subtle changes in air quality that were happening around them as the concentration of toxic gases gradually increased to deadly levels. The invisible threat crept closer with each passing minute, following the natural airflow patterns that would inevitably bring it into contact with anyone working in the deepest sections of the cave. The first symptoms may have been barely noticeable, a slight shortness of breath that could easily be blamed on the physical work, or mild dizziness that might have seemed like nothing more than the result of working in the artificial lighting underground. But the gases were relentless in their attack on the human body, binding to red blood cells and preventing the transport of oxygen to vital organs, even as their victims continued to breathe what looked like normal air. As the toxic concentration reached deadly levels, Wallace and Sagendorf experienced a terrifying increase in symptoms that turned their routine morning into a desperate fight for survival, their vision blurring and their coordination failing as the invisible poison moved through their bloodstreams. The cave system that had been like a second home for years suddenly became a death trap, its familiar passages transformed into dangerous corridors, where each breath brought them closer to unconsciousness and death. The moment when both men collapsed in the depths of the cavern marked the terrible end of a chain of events that had been set in motion by the morning's quarry blast, their bodies finally giving in to the toxic attack that had been building in their systems with each breath. In the eerie silence of the underground chamber, lit only by the electrical systems that Wallace had maintained so carefully, 2 lives were ended by an enemy they never saw coming. Meanwhile, on the surface, a 25-year-old cave guide was growing worried about his missing colleagues, his concern increasing as the minutes passed, without any sign of Wallace and Sagendorf returning from what should have been a quick maintenance check. The guide's decision to go into the cave system to look for them would prove to be both heroic and nearly fatal, as he unknowingly descended into the same toxic atmosphere that had already killed 2 men. Following the route he knew the missing men had taken, the guide made his way through passages that were still being filled with deadly gases, each step taking him deeper into an environment where the air itself had become poisonous. His discovery of the collapsed bodies of Wallace and Sagendorf in the chamber near the Bell of Moscow formation was a moment of pure shock, but even as he tried to understand the tragedy before him, the same invisible killer was beginning its attack on his own body. The guide's growing awareness that he was experiencing the same symptoms that had killed his colleagues, the increasing dizziness, the trouble breathing, the growing weakness that threatened to pull him down into the same unconsciousness that had claimed Wallace and Sagendorf, turned his rescue mission into a desperate race against time to escape the toxic environment before it could claim a 3rd victim. Fighting against the effects of gas poisoning that grew stronger with each passing second, he gave up any hope of helping the fallen men and focused entirely on reaching the elevator that was his only path to survival. The guide's terrifying journey back through the poisoned passages, struggling against failing coordination and fading consciousness as he stumbled toward the elevator, showed incredible human determination in the face of death. Each step was a victory against the toxic gases that wanted to drag him down with his colleagues, his survival hanging in the balance as he fought to stay conscious long enough to reach the surface and raise the alarm. His collapse upon reaching the surface was a dramatic and frightening announcement of the disaster that had happened in the depths below, his barely conscious condition providing clear evidence of the deadly conditions that had developed within the cave system. The immediate rush to get the guide to a hospital in Albany, where doctors worked to treat the effects of gas poisoning, showed just how severe the toxic exposure had been that had already killed 2 men and nearly killed a 3rd. Upon confirmation of the severity and gas threat, rescue teams assembled. Using oxygen equipment and gas mitigation precautions, though rudimentary by modern standards, they successfully retrieved Wallace and Sagendorf's bodies and brought them to the surface later that morning. As news of the tragedy spread through the community of Brahmanville, Elizabeth Eliza Millspaugh found herself at the center of a communications crisis that overwhelmed the small town's telephone system, her switchboard becoming the control center for frantic calls between the cavern's management, emergency responders, grieving family members, and newspaper reporters who were beginning to understand the size of the story developing in the depths of Howe Caverns. The medical examination of Owen Wallace and John Sagendorf confirmed what the guide's near-death experience had already suggested. Both men had died from suffocation caused by poisonous gases that had entered the cave system, their deaths directly connected to the morning's quarry blast that had unknowingly opened pathways for the invisible killer to reach them in their underground workplace. The aftermath of the tragedy brought Martha Wallace and Mabel Sagendorf together in grief and determination. The 2 widows united in their belief that their husbands' deaths were the result of carelessness by the North American Cement Company, whose massive quarry blast had created the conditions that turned a routine workday into a death sentence. Their decision to take legal action against the powerful corporation started a David versus Goliath battle that would continue for years, capturing public attention and highlighting the broader issues of industrial safety and corporate responsibility. However, archival summaries do not clarify the final verdict. Whether the widows won compensation or if the company was absolved remains uncertain in publicly available documentation. On an April morning in 2016, 41-year-old Dimitar decided to explore something that had caught his curiosity for weeks. A cave entrance he'd noticed near his hometown, Chetyar, a village in Bulgaria. Born with mental disabilities, Dimitar possessed a childlike wonder about the world around him and a fearless desire to investigate every interesting corner of his environment. His slight, agile build and compact frame made him capable of squeezing through spaces that would challenge much larger individuals. Living with his devoted grandmother, Dimitar had heard local villagers mention Uske Cave in passing conversations. The limestone formation seemed harmless enough from the outside, just a dark opening in the hillside that appeared to lead into the earth. With the innocent confidence of someone who had never encountered real danger in his gentle explorations around the village, Dimitar grabbed a small flashlight and set off to satisfy his curiosity about what lay beyond that mysterious entrance. Uske Cave welcomed him with a horizontal passage that seemed easy to navigate. The cave was completely dry and at 466 feet, 142 meters long. It appeared to be nothing more than a simple tunnel through the limestone. Dimitar's small frame allowed him to move through the narrower sections with ease. The initial passages were straightforward enough, and Dimitar felt confident as he explored the main tunnel. The cave's horizontal layout meant there were no dangerous drops or vertical challenges to worry about, just a series of passages that grew narrower as they wound deeper into the hillside. His childlike innocence meant he approached this adventure with the same innocent enthusiasm he brought to all his explorations, unaware of the basic safety principles that experienced cave explorers would consider essential. As Dimitar ventured further into the cave system, he encountered several side passages that branched off from the main tunnel. These smaller passages intrigued him, and he began exploring them one by one, crawling through increasingly tight spaces with the determination of someone driven by pure curiosity. Each side passage seemed to lead to another, creating a maze-like network that gradually drew him deeper into the cave's interior. Everything went fine until he decided to head out. Dimitar tried to retrace his route back to the entrance. The cave's layout, which had seemed simple during his inward journey, now became confusing in reverse. Multiple passages looked similar, and without any system for marking his route, he began to second-guess which tunnel would lead him back to daylight. The mental challenges that affected his daily life now became critical obstacles to navigation, as he struggled to maintain a clear mental map of his underground journey. Growing increasingly disoriented, Dimitar spent precious time crawling back and forth between passages and walls that all began to look the same. As he struggled through the narrow spaces, he somehow lost his jacket. In his confused state and growing panic, he left it behind, focusing only on finding his way out. Each wrong turn deepened his confusion and used up more of his flashlight's battery power. As hours passed, Dimitar's small flashlight began to dim. The batteries, never intended to power an extended underground expedition, were reaching the end of their life. The beam grew weaker and more yellow, casting increasingly feeble light on the cave walls around him. When the flashlight finally died, Dimitar found himself engulfed in a darkness more complete than anything he had ever experienced. The cave's blackness was absolute, pressing in on him from all directions and making it impossible to see even his own hands. Unable to navigate in the pitch-black conditions and exhausted from his frantic attempts to find the exit, he crawled into one of the narrow side passages where he had been exploring earlier. In that cramped space, about 82 feet, 25 meters from the cave entrance, but impossibly lost in the darkness, Dimitar curled up in what seemed like a comfortable position, one hand tucked beneath his head as a makeshift pillow. He settled down to rest, perhaps believing that someone would come looking for him, or that he could wait for daylight to somehow find its way into the cave. His innocence may have prevented him from fully understanding the severity of his situation, or the fact that no natural light would ever penetrate the depths where he now lay. What Dimitar couldn't comprehend was how quickly the cave's environment would affect his body. The constant temperature deep underground, while not freezing, was significantly cooler than the warm April air outside. Without proper clothing or any source of heat, his body began losing its core temperature. Combined with the physical and mental exhaustion from his ordeal, hypothermia began to set in as he lay in his makeshift resting place. But he kept on. waiting for someone to come get him. Outside the cave, as the hours turned to days, Dimitar's grandmother began to worry. He had never stayed away from home for extended periods, and his routine was usually predictable. When he failed to return home that first evening, she assumed he had found something particularly interesting to occupy his attention. But as the second day passed without any sign of him, her concern turned to alarm. The small village erupted into chaos as word spread that Dimitar was missing. Neighbors organized search parties, combing the surrounding countryside and checking every location where he was known to spend time. His grandmother, elderly and frail, stood helplessly in her doorway, calling his name and scanning the horizon for any sign of her beloved grandson's return. Local authorities were contacted and a wider search began. Police officers interviewed villagers, trying to piece together Dimitar's last known movements and any clues about where he might have gone. The search expanded to include nearby fields, forests, and abandoned buildings, but no trace of him could be found. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The mystery of his disappearance deepened. Meanwhile, deep in the darkness of Uska Cave, Dimitar lay motionless in the narrow side passage where he had sought refuge. The cave's dry environment had begun the slow process of preserving his remains. 5 months passed before police received crucial information that Dimitar had expressed interest in visiting the local cave. This breakthrough finally gave searchers a specific location to investigate, leading to the Fire Safety and Civil Protection Team's initial search on September 14, 2016. When they found the jacket and flashlight inside the passages of the cave, but couldn't reach the deeper sections, the Bulgarian cave rescue team was called in. On September 15, 2016, 2 experienced cave rescuers squeezed through the narrow passages of Uski Cave. At 3:30 p.m., they discovered his remains in the side passage where he had curled up to rest, his body positioned exactly as he had settled down on that fateful April day when his adventure had turned into a tragedy. After documenting the scene and consulting with police and the coroner, the rescue team received permission to retrieve Dimitar's body. The advanced state of decomposition after 5 months in the cave's dry, warm environment made the recovery operation extremely challenging. At 6 p.m., the cave rescue team returned to the depths, now equipped with protective masks and gloves to handle the delicate task ahead. Working in the cramped, suffocating confines of the narrow passage, the rescuers had to first dig out the cave floor to create enough space for the recovery operation. The dry cave environment had naturally preserved the remains, making them surprisingly light but extremely fragile. 2 rescuers carefully placed a specialized sling around Dimitar's body and began the painstaking process of sliding him out of the tight squeeze, using a PVC sheet to protect both the remains and the cave floor during extraction. Every movement had to be calculated and precise in the confined space, as the fragile state of the body required the utmost care. After hours of methodical work in conditions that challenged even these experienced professionals, Dimitar's remains were finally brought to the surface at 8:05 p.m., ending a recovery operation that was as emotionally draining as it was technically difficult. The investigation revealed that Dimitar had died from hypothermia and exhaustion, trapped not by the cave's physical constraints, but by the impenetrable darkness that followed his flashlight's failure. His death was a preventable tragedy that highlighted how quickly innocent exploration can become deadly when proper preparation and safety measures are ignored.